Afghanistan, 1 year later. What's happened since American troops pulled out and the Taliban poured in? Eyewitness accounts of the day Kabul fell. Millions of Afghans turned refugees, but where did they go? Plus, the raid that killed Al-Qaeda's top terrorist. What's next? Now, on the Inside Story, Afghanistan, 1 year later.
Hi, I'm Anita Powell, VOA White House correspondent. 1 year ago this week, Taliban fighters re-entered Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. It had been nearly 20 years since Taliban were driven from power by US bombs and troops who were hunting the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks and those who harbored them. The Taliban's return to power came as the final American troops were leaving the country after President Joe Biden announced a complete US withdrawal by the end of last August. We all remember the chilling images of desperate Afghans trying to climb the fences at the Kabul airport, some even holding on to airplanes taking off. This week, we will look at what has changed for those remaining in Afghanistan, look at some of the lives of those who left, and hear recollections of what it was like to live through the fall of Kabul. We'll start with unheard voices. Girls and women in Afghanistan who once again have seen rights and privileges taken away since the Taliban regained power 1 year ago. Despite promises by the Biden administration for the protection of human rights, the quality of life for women in Afghanistan continues to steadily decline. In the years since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, women and girls have seen their rights degrade dramatically, despite what the White House says are their constant efforts to pressure the Islamist group. During the chaotic withdrawal last year, the White House touted their influence over the group.
We have an enormous amount of leverage, this is our view, over time. That includes economic leverage, it includes leverage that we will make clear to the Taliban as it relates to coordination, continue to get American citizens and our partners out.
But since taking power last August, the hardline group has prevented most girls from going to school, forcing them into secret schools. And they've ordered women to cover their faces and stopped issuing driver's licenses to women. The group pegs these edicts to their strict interpretation of Islam. The U.S. pressure is not enough, say advocates.
It's basically been, leverage that has not worked, frankly, it's sort of it's essentially time that we acknowledge that. There's also sort of the question of diplomatic recognition, but that's a question that's sort of far down the road. I mean, the question of the other kinds of aid, the question of, the unfreezing of the central bank reserves, all of those questions sort of come first. And even that is leverage that essentially has not worked.
The U.S. isn't the only nation speaking out for Afghan women. Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, have also tried, again, with no effect. And analysts say the sanctioning of the Taliban has led to a humanitarian crisis that disproportionately hurts women and children, and could threaten the main U.S. priority for Afghanistan, which is to prevent it from becoming a terrorist haven again.
I think that many in Afghanistan would blame the United States to an extent for the current state of affairs of the humanitarian crisis, in that, it's the U.S. that led these efforts to sanction the Taliban many years ago. The sanctions are still there. And it's mainly because of those sanctions that you're not having money coming into the country. And because money's not coming into the country, that's a big reason for the economic crisis.
And what do the women of Afghanistan want?
We want to live as human beings, and not as captives in the corner of the house, not be held in a cage, and our husbands go and beg for food. We don't ever want this.
But for Afghanistan's 19 million girls and women, this demand is being denied. The anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal was celebrated in Kabul, with Taliban fighters brandishing flags and guns in the streets as supporters marched past the shuttered U.S. embassy chanting, "Long live Islam" and "Death to America." So how did we get here? VOA's Aisha Tanzim takes us through the past 12 months in Afghanistan.
On August 15, 2021, Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The government collapsed and the Taliban took control of Kabul. The speed of the Taliban's victory shocked the world and threw U.S. evacuation plans into disarray.
This did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated.
Thousands of Afghans rushed to the airport, with chaos erupting as they tried to flee. On August 17, the new leaders tried to present a face different than their last time in power. They promised Afghanistan would not be used to attack other countries as it had been in September 2001, and vowed to protect women's right to work and study under the framework of Islam. On August 26, an attack by the Islamic State of Khorasan province, ISIS-K, outside the airport killed 170 civilians and 13 U.S. security personnel. On August 31st, the last U.S. forces left Afghanistan, bringing an end to a 20-year war. The U.S. spent more than $2 trillion, lost more than 6,000 service members and contractors. Thousands of people who assisted the U.S. over the years remain trapped inside Afghanistan.
We've worked intensely to evacuate and relocate Afghans.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken promised that the U.S. would work to evacuate them.
We've gotten many out.
In the first weeks of Taliban rule, many Afghan women protested, demanding equal rights. On September 7, the Taliban announced a new caretaker government. Mohammad Hassan Akhund, on a U.S. sanctions list, was chosen to head the government. Sirajuddin Haqqani, on the FBI's most wanted list, was named the Interior Minister. There was no mention of the Women's Ministry, a department responsible for women's rights and advancement before the new Taliban rule. With the exit of the international community, humanitarian aid dried up, and Afghanistan's food crisis worsened. Combined with the U.S. freeze on the Afghan Central Bank's assets, worth $9.5 billion, the Afghan economy plunged into free fall.
Si on veut que l'Afghanistan ne soit pas un centre de terrorisme.
On September 13, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that poverty and hunger were spiraling out of control and appealed to the world community for help. On September 24, the US paved the way for sending aid to Afghanistan by allowing limited engagement with the Taliban.
یو بده خاطره چې موږ ته په تحصیلي میدان کې پاتې ده هغه دا چې دلته مخلوط تعلیم.
Despite promises to protect women's rights, on December 26, the Taliban banned women from traveling alone for more than 72 kilometers without a male companion. On March 23, 2022, the Taliban said girls' high schools would remain closed until they could be opened in accordance with Islamic law. On May 7, the Taliban ordered women to wear the head-to-toe burqa in public. On May 19, the Taliban said that female TV presenters should cover their faces. On June 22, a major earthquake killed over 1,000 people in the country's southeast.
UNAMA, we are deeply concerned about the apparent impunity with which human rights violations have been carried out to date.
On July 20, a UN report estimated that about 60% of the population needed humanitarian assistance. The report also accused the new government of human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, torture, and illegal detentions. It found the most notable aspect of Taliban's rule was the erosion of women's rights. By mid-2022, some 79,000 Afghan refugees have been settled in the U.S. since the Taliban came to power. Thousands more wait outside the U.S. for their paperwork to be processed. On the morning of July 31st, Al-Qaeda's top leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was killed in a U.S. drone strike in Kabul.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Even after a year, not a single country has formally recognized the Taliban government.
Let's go a bit deeper into one of those recent events on the timeline, the US-directed killing of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. When he announced the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, President Biden vowed the US would maintain what's called over-the-horizon operations to prevent al-Qaeda and other terror organizations from finding refuge in Afghanistan. The White House acknowledges cutting off the head of the beast may not neutralize the threat. The White House says it has high confidence that its targeted strike killed al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri.
We have eliminated the emir of al-Qaeda.
But the White House also says cutting off the head of the beast may not neutralize the threat.
They're in North Africa, they're in the Sahel, they're throughout the Middle East, they're in Yemen. I get that we're focused on Afghanistan right now, but we're not taking our eye off the rest of the world either.
Since Osama bin Laden formed the group in 1988, al-Qaeda has sprouted numerous offshoots, united over the decades by intolerance, hatred of the US and Israel, and a strict interpretation of Islam.
Al-Qaeda may not be actively, operationally planning an attack on US soil, but ideologically, it remains ideologically opposed to the US. So, that very fact is something that we shouldn't overlook.
Especially in Africa, where affiliates have flourished.
My advice to Biden and to the American government is that, yes, okay, we can kill the leadership, but I think it's a very tiny aspect of the fight against terrorism. The focus should actually be on addressing, the factors, the political and economic factors that actually shield terrorism, or which actually give oxygen, to terrorism around the world.
But al-Zawahiri's death will affect these groups. Although he was not a charismatic leader like bin Laden, he was a disciplined one.
Zawahiri was effective in kind of keeping this broader network of affiliates, franchise groups, and branches together, from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa and further afield. That's probably what he should get the most credit for, is maintaining that alliance and doing it through the turbulent period of the Arab Spring and the rise of the Islamic State.
So what now? On that, the president was clear.
My administration will continue to vigilantly monitor and address threats from al-Qaeda, no matter where they emanate from.
Analysts also urged patience.
These groups are patient and they're highly capable. And so to dismiss them as kind of a nuisance or a has-been, and I know everybody wants to focus on great power competition with Russia and China and kind of leave behind the global war on terrorism, I would say, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center the first time in 1993, killing 6 people. At the time, they were a relatively obscure group, until September 11th, 2001.
زه په 15 د اګوست په افغانستان کې وم او ما د طالبانو راتګ په سترګو لیدلی. شبنم سالیم د افغانستان د بشر د حقوقو خپلواک کمیسیون د ښځو د بخښ کمیشنر د کابل پوهنتون استاده. 11 بجې شاوخوا زموږ د امنیت مسؤل رادننه سو او راته ویل چې کمیشنر صاحب که دفتر پرېږدي ښه به وي. زه رالم ډرایور و محافظ سره له کمیسیون راووتم. داسې ځای کې م رارسېدلی تر 10 متره مخکې 15 متره مخکې هم طالبان را سړک ته راغلي دي او سپین بیرغ یې پورته کړی ده او زما موټر یو دولتي موټر و. په موټر کې ډرایور راته وایي چې ښه ده چې له دې موټره کته سي، له دې خطر سي دا موټر په خپله یو د خطر زنګ ده. په داسې یو وضعیت کې مور مې ډېره زیاته سخته اندېښنه او د غونه مې زنګ راته زویه چېرته راورسېدې او ما به ورته چې مورې هلته چې وم هلته یم ښه خو یې شاوخوا خو څوک نشته خطر خو به نه وي درته. بیا چې به مې اخر ورته نه مورې ولا هېڅ هم نشته. بیا ورته قسم راته وخوره چې ته خو ښه یې هله زر راسه کور ته. دغه اخري وار مې ورته مال مورې زه تلیفون ګل کوم. د استاد مې راته میسج وکړو چې تلیفون دې ګل که زه شاید د تلیفون له طریقه ته ټرک سي او پیدا سي. شاید ما دغه اخري خبرې دغه خبره مې زه احساس کوم چې د ژوند تر ټولو هغه سخته خبره چې ما مور ته کړې کور ته چې رالم زه مې حنا راسره کړې چې انا مې راته چیغه کړه او ما چیغه کړه او داسې احساس مې وکړو چې نور ژوند ختم ده او موږ هر څه بایللي. په 23 یعنې 3 ورځې متواتر موږ د میدان بېلابېلې لارې وکتلې، بېلابېل دروازو ته یې ولاړو ولې موافق نه سو چې دننه سو میدان ته. له 10 ساعتونو وروسته موږ په دې بریالي شو چې میدان ته داخل سو. شپې 8 بجې زموږ پرواز آماده سو او پرواز مو کو پوهېږم نه چې کومې خواته ځو تر هغه وخته پورې ماته خپل منزل معلوم نه دی زه کومې خواته ځم زه باوجود دې چې ایواکویشن لیټر لرم له 4 هیوادونو نه ولې زه نه پوهېږم زه کومې خواته ځم تیارې کې خلک ژاړي او هر چا خاوره له ځان سره راخسي څوک د وطن یاد کوي البانیا ته ورسېدو البانیا د شرقي اروپا یو هیواد ده او ما داسې احساس وکړو چې نور خو هر څه له لاسه ولاړو او هېڅ نه لرو او زه نور بېکوره سوم او نور زه بیرته د وطن ته د تګ بله لهر نه لرم اکتوبر په 14 د تېر کال د 2020 کال زه کاناډا ته رالم
من نگین خلیلی هستم رئیس بودم در بخش منع و آزار اذیت زنان در روی سارنولی روزی که طالبان افغانستان آمدن 15 آگوست به دفتر بودم ساعت 11:30 بود که دیدم همه همکارای ما همه در حال فرار بودن همکارم داخل دروازه شد و برام گفت که فرار کن به خاطر که طالبان به کوت سنگی رسیدن و قرار است که همه جا را بگیرن حیران بودم کجا برم و چی باید بکنم تصمیم گرفتم که دفتر رها کنم و طرف خانه برم دیدم که نمیشه باید پیاده شوم از موتر پیاده شدم بوتایم بلند بود و دیدم که همگی میدون برام یکی گفت که چادری بپوش که نشناسند من چند تا مردا بچه ها و همینطور کسای کلانسن بودن من لباس دفتریم جانم بود و چادر و امو حجابات که در افغانستان قابل مراعات بود او را مراعات هم کرده بودم و وقت اونا ما دید بر من گفت که خوب شد کشور سقوط کرد و این از خاطر شما زناست همان شب مطمئن هستم هیچ کسی در افغانستان نخوابید هیچ کس جرأت نمیکرد موسیقی بشنوه تمامی اسناد و مدارکی که به زبان انگلیسی داشتیم یا از کارهای ما بود خواستم او را از بین ببرم و اگر اتفاق شنیده بودیم که خانار تلاشی میکنن یادم است که همون روز در تاریخ 15 آگوست طرفای دیگر بود که برام یک زنگ آمد و زنگ کسی بود که من سارنوالش بودم قبلا تحقیقش کرده بودم برام زنگ زد گفت ما آزاد شدیم و پیدایت میکنم تهدیدمان کرد یعنی که وقت پیدایتان کردیم دیگه زنده نخواهد ماندین و تاریخی که قرار بود ما بسها را ترک کنیم به مقصد میدان هوایی به همونجا چند تا از عساکر طالبان هم بودن و اونا گفتن عیف که ما شما را پیش ندیده بودیم یعنی منظورشان این است که اگر ما شما را قبلا میدیدیم میکشتیمتان تصمیم بسیار سخت بود که بخوایم کشور ما ترک کنم در یک دوراهی مانده بودم بین رفتن و ماندن ولی وقت وضعیت را دیدم و تهدیدهایی که متوجه من بود مجبور بری شدم که باید کشور را ترک کنم داخل میدان شدیم ساعت 4 صبح بود منتظر بودیم که شاید پرواز شود آفتاب بی نهایت سوزان و گرم بود از طرف دیگه اطفال که بسیار گریه میکردن و میخواستن خانه باشن مادرهایی را دیدم که خانمهایی که حتی حمل داشتن باردار بودن و حتی چند تایشان که زمان حملشان فرا رسیده بود که باید طفلشان تولد شود اونجا بودن سخت است که هیچ کار ندانی و مجبور شوی که کشورت و مردمت ترک کنی و راهی جز فرار نداشته باشی راهی که فقط باید به یک آینده که بر دیگرها شاید خوب باشه و بتونن زندگی خوب داشته باشن
There are more than 2.5 million Afghan refugees, according to the United Nations. More than 1 million of them fled to Pakistan, where life running from the Taliban becomes more difficult without proper documentation. From Islamabad, VOA's Malik Bakar Ahmed shows us the challenges the refugees face.
17-year-old Benazir Akhtari is teaching kids in a roadside tent in Islamabad, Pakistan. Like her, these kids don't have many opportunities to get a formal education.
I came to Pakistan full of hope, thinking that I would continue my education here. For 6 months, I knocked on the door of every school. None would take me because I don't have a POR card.
Akhtari is just one of roughly 250,000 Afghans who fled to Pakistan last year. Once in the country, Afghan refugees can receive a proof of registration card or POR, which allows them to live in Pakistan legally. The card is issued by the Pakistan government in coordination with the UN refugee agency, the UNHCR. Because so many refugees need the card, the wait can last a year or longer. And that is making life incredibly hard.
Getting a house for rent is very difficult. We can't get SIM cards for our phones. Any basic necessity is hard to get without this card.
Even before the Taliban takeover, nearly 3 million Afghan refugees lived in Pakistan. Many of them arrived in the 1980s, during the decade-long Afghan war between the Soviet Union and Afghan religious fighters known as the Mujahideen. Even some of these refugees from decades ago don't have official refugee status. Many of the newly arrived refugees say they want to move elsewhere, mostly to Europe or North America. Officials at the UNHCR say issuing the card takes time and effort.
When people arrive in such a huge number, it becomes very difficult to process them. We have increased our capacity, but we must interview and screen them properly, so it takes time.
Meanwhile, without the card, the refugees can't access even the most fundamental needs like healthcare.
Once I went to the hospital, but they wanted to see my documents. At the time, I had neither a refugee card nor a passport, so I couldn't get treated.
Akhtari wonders if her dream of becoming a doctor will be crushed as she waits to be legally recognized in Pakistan. For Malik Waqar Ahmed in Islamabad, Pakistan, Aisha Tanzim, VOA News.
Before we go, a taste of the bittersweet story of 2 Afghan sisters who aspire to be musicians. But Farida and Zohra Ahmadi were unable to escape with the rest of students at the Afghanistan National Institute of Music. Symphony of Courage is a new VOA documentary that follows the girls on their journey to freedom. Here's a slice of the documentary.
When the Taliban reached the gates of Kabul, I began panicking. I began panicking for the lives of my students, my community. We all know that when the Taliban are in charge, they're going to steal music away from the life of the Afghan people.
Dr. Sarmas has brought together different ethnic groups from all across Afghanistan that have traditionally not gotten along to play music in harmony together in these ensembles. He gave them a life in music.
When everyone else were evacuated from Afghanistan, they reached Doha safely. There was Zohra and Farida and their uncle left behind.
ما را فریده و زهره را با مشکل مواجه ساختن. اونجا متاسفانه ما با مشکل برخوردیم.
For me, it was important not to leave anyone behind. It was important to get them. They were the 2 youngest. They were also girls. They were girls musicians. So girls, musicians, under the Taliban, you have a hell in Afghanistan, not a life.
You can watch all of Symphony of Courage on our website, voanews.com, and on our new free streaming service, VOA+. I'm Anita Powell. Follow me on Twitter at 6armspowell, and follow VOA News on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks for being with us. See you next week for the Inside Story.